November 27th, 1991, Logan Place, Kensington, London, 4 days after. The car stopped on the street he hadn't been able to look at since Tuesday. John Deacon sat in the back seat for 11 minutes without moving. The driver didn't turn around. The sky was the color of a ceiling nobody had painted in a long time, and the bare trees on the street looked like they had decided something. John opened the door. He didn't lock it behind him. The gate to Garden Lodge was unlocked, and he pushed it open with 2 fingers, and it swung without sound, and he didn't know why he noticed that. He'd been here 100 times. He'd sat in that kitchen and drunk tea from the same mug and argued about bass lines and left his jacket on the same hook inside the front door. He knew this house. He walked up the path, and the gravel didn't make the sound it used to, and he didn't know if that was the gravel or him. Mary Austin opened the door before he knocked. She looked at him. She didn't say anything. He stepped past her, and she let him. The house smelled wrong. The flowers people had left outside had begun to come through the walls somehow, sweet and wrong. And underneath that was something familiar he couldn't name, something that had been fabric and soap and warmth, and was now only a direction the nose went in that led to nothing. He didn't go to the sitting room. He didn't go to the kitchen. He went upstairs. He knew which one was the room. He had never been in it. In 10 years of coming to this house, Freddie's bedroom had been a door at the top of the stairs that John had passed and never opened. Some spaces belonged to the person in them. He stood at the door for a long time, long enough that he could hear Mary somewhere below, moving slowly through a room, not speaking to anyone. Long enough that he started to understand he was afraid. He opened the door. The room was too ordinary. That was the first thing. He had expected something, he didn't know what. A room that announced itself. A room that held its breath. This room had afternoon light coming through curtains the color of old gold, and it fell on a wooden floor and a chair with a coat draped over it that nobody had moved, and a small table beside the bed with a glass on it still, with water in it. Perfectly still. John stood in the doorway. He didn't go in yet. He looked at the glass. It had been 4 days. The water was still there. Somebody had not been able to move the water. He understood that. He stood at the threshold of the room of his friend who was dead, and he understood exactly why no one had moved the glass. He walked in. 3 steps. He stopped beside the chair with the coat on it, and he put his hand on the coat, and the coat was cold. He took his hand away. He looked at the bed which was made, which was wrong. Someone had made the bed. And he thought about who had done that, and then stopped thinking about it. He looked at the table. There was the glass of water. There was a small lamp. There was a book, face down, open to a page that nobody would ever read again. And there was a piece of paper. He didn't pick it up immediately. He stood there and looked at it for long enough to understand that he was going to pick it up, and that picking it up meant something he hadn't decided about yet. The paper was unlined, folded once. It had been written on. He could see the edge of the handwriting from where he stood, dark and slightly slanted. The kind of handwriting that belonged to a person who wrote quickly and without hesitation. Freddie had written quickly and without hesitation in everything. Every lyric, every note, every message left on kitchen counters. John picked up the paper. He unfolded it. He read it. It was not addressed to anyone. It was not signed. It was 3 lines, possibly 4, the last one trailing off at the end of a thought that had not been completed. The last word on the paper ended in the middle of itself, as if Freddie had stopped writing because something had interrupted him, and he had meant to come back, and he had not come back. John stood with the paper in his hands. He read it again. He read it a 3rd time. The light in the room had shifted slightly, and somewhere outside a door opened and closed, and a taxi went down the street, and the city was happening without permission. He folded the paper back along its crease. He put it back on the table, exactly where it had been. He sat down on the floor, not in the chair, not on the bed. He sat down on the wooden floor of Freddie Mercury's bedroom, and he put his back against the side of the bed, and he sat there. He did not cry. He had cried 4 days ago, and the day before that, and on the morning of the funeral he had cried in the car, and Veronica had held his hand, and he had not been able to explain to her what he was crying about, because there were too many things, and they were all true at once. He wasn't crying now. He was sitting on the floor of a room that held a glass of water that no one could move, and a piece of paper with someone's handwriting on it that ended in the middle of a word, and he was sitting on the floor because standing had become an argument he didn't have the energy for. John Deacon was 40 years old. He had been in a band with Freddie Mercury for 21 years. He had written You're My Best Friend in 1974 on a Wurlitzer in a flat in London, and Freddie had listened to it and looked at him and said, simply, yes, and they had never needed to discuss it further. 21 years. He sat on the floor. He didn't know how long he was there. Long enough for the light to change again, the afternoon beginning to make its slow decision toward evening. Long enough for him to stop thinking in sentences and just be in the room with the way it was. He was not the kind of person who talked about things. He had never been. The others talked, Brian talked, and Roger talked, and in their way of talking, they processed and they expressed, and they kept moving, and John had always watched that and understood it and not been able to do it. He processed things by playing bass. He processed things by going home to Veronica and sitting in his kitchen and being present in a room that was his and alive. There was no bass here. This was not his kitchen. He stood up eventually. He didn't look at the paper again. He didn't look at the glass. He walked to the door and through the door and pulled it until it clicked and stood in the corridor for a moment with his hand still on the handle. Then he walked downstairs. Mary was in the sitting room. She looked up when he came in. She had a cup of tea in her hands, not drinking it, just holding it. "Did you find what you needed?" she said. John looked at her. He thought about the question. "I don't know," he said. Mary nodded. She looked back down at her tea. John stood in the room for another moment, and then he put on his coat and walked to the front door and opened it and went outside. The gravel was the gravel again. The trees were trees. The street was what it was, and the car was still there, and the driver was reading something, and the city was doing what cities do, which is to continue. John got in the car. The driver looked up. John didn't say anything. The driver pulled away from the curb. John watched Garden Lodge through the window until the street turned, and it was gone. He looked at his hands in his lap. He had been in that room. He had read those words. He knew what Freddie had been writing about. He would never say. Some things you carry alone not because you have to, but because the weight of them is precisely the thing that tells you what they meant. He folded his hands together. The car moved through London. He rode in the back in silence. He has been in silence ever since.